The British Museum contains lots of Bibles, and many of those are significant documents in their own right, but none of them is more significant than the Codex Sinaiticus, which is a 4th century manuscript that comes from a pivotal time in world history and whose discovery revolutionized the way we think about the text of the Bible. So that picture shows the Codex on display in the British Museum in 2005. It comprises just over 400 leaves of vellum. Each page is 380 millimeters high and 345 millimeters wide. That means a little more than 15 inches high and just under 14 inches wide. And most of the pages have the text arranged in 4 columns. Manuscript was copied in the middle of the 4th century AD. It had originally contained the whole of both the Old and New Testaments, along with a few other books. But parts of the Old Testament are now missing, and it's written in Greek. It's a Greek Old Testament and the entire New Testament in Greek as well. The binding that you can see is a modern binding. It was bound originally, that binding perished, and one suspects that it's been rebound many times since it was first written down. So let's start off difference in a codex and a scroll. A codex, of course, is a book like the books most of us have on our bookshelves at home. The pages are bound at one end and you can turn pages over. The alternative arrangement is the scroll, where the sheets are joined edge to edge to make one great big long sheet, which is then rolled up. And there are all sorts of problems with scrolls compared to the codex. One of them is that in a codex you've got a spine. You can write the name of the book on the spine, so you can look along a shelf of books and see which one you want, get it out and read it. If you've got a set of scrolls, then they look like that when they're out, and that means it's very hard to decide which one you want to get hold of. Typically, have bits of string hanging out from them with a label attached to each bit of string, and then they get tangled up, and it doesn't help. The scroll also makes it very difficult to get to a particular passage. If you want to get to something on page 200 on a codex, you can sort of look through and turn up almost that and then turn over a few pages to get the right one. In a scroll, you've got to wind through, and that takes a long time. So the codex is a definite advantage over a scroll. Now, the New Testament was written in the 1st century AD. It was written in Greek. It would almost certainly be written on papyrus. That was the most common writing material at the time. And books were initially probably circulated separately rather than bound together into a single volume. Very soon, copies were made and distributed around the congregations, and then it got translated into ancient languages. We know from the first letter of Clement of Rome that there were translations into Latin already, at least one translation he was using. Other translations followed into more into different translations into Latin, but also into language like Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Ethiopic, and so on. And the message spread outside the empire. It spread to places where people didn't speak Greek very early on. Copies were made by hand. It was the only way of copying a book at the time. Printing hadn't been invented. So skilled scribes would take a document, which they called an exemplar, or later on was called an exemplar, and they then made a handwritten copy of it, and that was your book. But there are difficulties with this process. First of all, it's time consuming. Making a single copy of the whole Bible would take a professional scribe full time 2 years to achieve. And it would also be expensive. The wages of a scribe would be considerable. He's a professional character. Think of a solicitor or solicitor's clerk nowadays. He'd be an educated man. The parchment was a very expensive material. In fact, parchment cost more than the labor of someone copying it. It was a hugely expensive business. The cost of the Codex Sinaiticus is estimated as equivalent to the full lifetime earnings of someone on median income. Finally, the process was error prone. The Jewish scribes who copied the Old Testament devised an almost incredible system of tests and checks which eliminated error, but that was at a cost. It took a very long time to copy a Jewish scroll. The New Testament copyists didn't use a system like that. They just did their best. Now, having said that, most of them were very, very good at copying, but some of them weren't quite so good, and a few of them were frankly incompetent. And that means that occasionally errors would creep into the New Testament manuscripts. I was looking at one earlier on today. It's manuscript 780, where there's the genealogy of Jesus written out in columns. It goes down one column and then down the next column, but the scribe hasn't realized that, and he's gone across the columns instead. And so the genealogy doesn't really make much sense. And that's what might happen if you were at the end of a 12-hour shift and getting very tired. Anyway, the first book to be printed using movable type was a copy of the Bible in Latin, and that's done by Johannes Gutenberg. So it's the Gutenberg Bible, and that was finished in 1455. It started in 1450. It took him 5 years, and he planned to produce 200 copies on paper and a further 30 copies of the Bible printed on vellum. In fact, he didn't manage to achieve this. In total, fewer than 200 copies were made, and the process took 5 years. Of course, it's the first book ever to be printed, so people later on made it easier than that. But the process actually still has speeded up making copies hugely. What it had managed to do was to make 200 copies in 5 years instead of making one copy every 2 years. You'd only have 2.5 copies by the old method. Now you've got nearly 200 instead. So it's a big saving, and Gutenberg thought of it as making scribes more efficient so that your monastery library would be able to get its books more easily. But there were other advantages as well. Manuscript copying carries on, in spite of the fact you've got this efficient method now of making copies rather faster. It goes on for at least another century, but it gets less and less common, and people take up the more modern method in the end. I suppose they're saying, well, it's nice to have a manuscript in your hand. Having one of these printed things is nothing like quite so nice, but it's so much cheaper and more convenient. And in the end, we've all gone over to printed books. That revolution in technology was then accompanied by a revolutionary development in scholarship. And you get Desiderius Erasmus, who looks at a small number of copies of the Greek New Testament, and he produces an edition of the New Testament in Greek, and it's printed. And by this time, printing has become sufficiently efficient for cheap copies of the Greek New Testament to be around all over the place. He actually includes a translation in Latin as well, in case you don't read Greek. That was printed in 1512. He won a race with the Roman Catholic Cardinal Francisco Jimenez. Jimenez actually completed his text first, but there were delays in printing it. Had to get the permission of the church, and that was slow, and that meant Erasmus got his edition in first. And Erasmus's Greek New Testament makes possible a huge number of translations, a complete avalanche of translating into the vernacular languages of the day. People without a full religious education after that could read the Bible for themselves. They didn't have to read it in Latin or in Greek. You could do this because the translators could get hold of a cheap Greek manuscript. They didn't have to go to a monastery and search through the library and pull out several volumes of handwritten manuscript. They could go and buy a copy of Erasmus's New Testament, and they could then translate it, and people could then study the Bible for themselves in their own language. And the knowledge was no longer a monopoly of the church and state. People could think for themselves. Now, Erasmus's text went through several different editions printed by different printers. One of them, the Robert Etienne edition of 1551, introduced the division of the text into numbered verses. Hadn't happened before then, and that's continued to the present day. So everybody uses Etienne's division into verses. And the Erasmus text also, it became the standard text that translations were made into other languages. From 1633, Elsevier made an edition of it, which he advertised by saying it was the text received everywhere. In Latin, that's the Textus, Receptus, and it became known as that ever after. But the problem is to know how accurate the text of Erasmus's Greek Bible actually was. And he doesn't use a large number of manuscripts. The Textus Receptus depends on just a small number of manuscripts. They're the ones that were available in Basel while Erasmus was living there and making his translations. He uses three main manuscripts for the Gospels, but later on he compares it with a fourth one. He uses two for Acts, two for the letters, and just one for the Revelation. And in fact, the manuscript he had for the Revelation had lost its last page, and the last 6 verses of Revelation were a translation that he made back into Greek from the Latin Vulgate. He later compares his text with minuscule 3. These are the numbers of the manuscripts. I'll explain those later on. Erasmus gets another one, which is number 3, and compares it, but he doesn't make much change. And in fact, right at the end, when he's doing his 3rd edition, he's forced to make changes from the rather dodgy manuscript, the Codex Montfortianus, which is brought up for him to have a look at. Specifically. Now, you can understand the problem. How do you know whether the Greek text that's used to produce all the vernacular Bibles is accurate? And that requires more manuscripts, and soon more manuscripts came to light. So 1512, Erasmus knows of 7 manuscripts. By 1604, Theodore Beza has added another 18 manuscripts to the set. And in 1625, Cariophilus makes a list of 22 manuscripts. Erasmus is, it's not plus 18, the 18 including Erasmus. In 1627, the Codex Alexandrinus arrives in Britain. It's a gift to the king, Charles I, by the Patriarch of Constantinople. And that manuscript is actually in the British Museum as well. and it's used as a source at the time. And then in 1707 we got John Mill, who lists 98 Greek manuscripts, and 1720 Bentley's listing 127. So the number of known manuscripts is going up. Manuscripts already existed, it just no one knew about them, and gradually the number they know about is going up. And then in 1775 you've got a fairly famous Bible scholar called Johann Jakob Griesbach, who knows of around 300 manuscripts, and he tries to put them into a systematic list and starts to make a systematic comparison with the Textus Receptus, and he starts to number his manuscripts, and the numbering system we use now is based very much on the system that Griesbach put together. And then the other scholar who makes a big difference is this chap, who is Constantin von Tischendorf. He did his doctorate in the University of Leipzig, and then a second higher doctorate in Habilitation in 1840, which includes writing a thesis on the text of the New Testament. And as a consequence, he's given a readership at Leipzig, and then he beetles off to Paris, where he studies the Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. There it is. That's another very old manuscript. That's probably 5th century, possibly early 5th century. And at first sight, it doesn't look very exciting. It's a volume containing the sermons of someone called Ephraim, who is a Syriac father, and a saint in the Orthodox Church. But if you look at it carefully, it's worked on parchment that's been reused. So they decided they wanted a copy of Ephraim's sermons for some reason, and there was a Bible around that was doing no good to anyone particularly at the time, so they scrubbed it off and then wrote on that. Parchment being expensive stuff, they'd reused it, but they weren't very good at scrubbing it off, and you can see the text underneath. You can see the text in Greek. There's the Unterschrift. There it is, and you can just about make it out. And Tischendorf spent years going through working out what the Greek text was. That's a palimpsest. A palimpsest is one of these reused manuscripts. So from in 1842 and 1843. Well, he studies it. He publishes it in 1842. Spent 2 years doing it. And in 1843, he sets off on a journey to look for more manuscripts. He goes to Italy, he goes to Egypt, and he goes into Sinai, and then he goes off into Syria as well. He's visiting monasteries all the way and trying to find out what's in their library. Are there any really ancient manuscripts of the Bible? And part way through that, he comes to St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. There's a picture of it. It's pretty remote. It's in a wild and inhospitable and dangerous part of the world, although it's a lot more inhospitable and dangerous now than it was when Tischendorf visited it. Tischendorf published an account of his visit when he returned, and according to this, he was staying in the monastery when he found pages of parchment in a basket in his room, ready to be used for kindling to light a fire. And when he asked about them, he was shown more pages, which had also been set aside to be burned. He asked to take them away, and the monks decided that the pages must have some value after all, and would only allow him to take a sample away with him, 43 pages out of the 129 that he'd seen at this stage. And Tischendorf returned with the pages to Leipzig, and he deposited them there in the university library, and they're still there. Now, there's some doubt as to that account. Apart from the bit that the pages are in Leipzig University Library, the rest of it is a bit dodgy. The monks of St. Catherine say that the pages were only lent to Tischendorf. They were well aware of what they were, but they let Tischendorf take some of them away so that he could have them verified in his university. They were expecting him to bring them back again. And there's two lots of evidence to support what the monks say. First of all, they actually have a receipt signed by Tischendorf, which includes a promise to bring the pages back, which is sort of a smoking gun. But the second point, of course, backs it up, is that parchment is essentially leather. It doesn't burn particularly well. It's very hard to burn it. It would be absolutely useless as kindling. The point about kindling is when you have your sparks from your flint that you're trying to light the fire with. You want something very flammable that will catch fire, and then you can use that with the kindling to get the fire going. Getting a fire going by trying to burn leather would be essentially impossible. So you don't see it as kindling. If you look in the sort of various archives as well, there's a chap called Vitaliano Donati, who's an Italian scholar, and he had seen the manuscript in 1761, and while he didn't fully recognize its importance, he didn't realize just quite how old it was. Nevertheless, he published an account of it, and he realized that how valuable it was and told the monks about it. Tischendorf visited Russia, where he became involved in Russian politics. He was able to carry out some actions on behalf of the Tsar, and as a result of this, he came back to St. Catherine's. He'd returned once before and got a rather frosty reception, which you can understand if they were expecting to bring their manuscript back, and he didn't. But he goes off to Russia, gets involved, and comes back again. This time he's got a letter from the Orthodox Patriarch in Russia, suggesting that they transfer the Codex Sinaiticus to another monastery at Mount Tabor, which is run by the same order of monks. And from there, the manuscripts take to St. Petersburg, where it remained for some decades. In 1849, the Tsar sent St. Catherine 7,000 rubles and 2,000 more to Mount Tabor, the monastery there, to compensate them for the loss of the manuscript. And the manuscript remained in St. Petersburg until quite a bit after the Russian Revolution, when the Soviet government found itself short of foreign currency and sold the Codex Sinaiticus to the British Museum for £100,000, which is about £7 million in today's money. That was raised by public subscriptions, crowdfunding, in 1933, and the manuscript was transferred to Britain, and it's in the British Museum Library. Well, it was then; it's now called the British Library. Anyway, in 1975, renovation work at St. Catherine's Monastery uncovered a forgotten room, which was hidden away in the basement, and there were 19 more manuscripts, ancient manuscripts there, and 48 slightly more modern ones, but still quite old. And they also found 12 more pages of the Codex Sinaiticus. They remain in St. Catherine's Monastery. So let's think about New Testament monuments, manuscripts. If you want to understand the significance of the Codex Sinaiticus, we have to look at a little more at the process of producing Greek manuscripts and critical texts in the New Testament. So that the first point is the material. The first New Testament manuscripts were written on papyrus, which you make from reeds, and is pretty rough. You get reeds horizontally on one side and vertically on the other side, and that makes the surface quite bumpy and hard to write on. But it was cheap. It's not very durable, though. It easily falls to bits, especially if it gets wet. But the church used it because they couldn't afford anything better. But in the 4th century, the church received the backing of the Roman state, and it was able to afford parchment. which is very long lasting indeed, but also very expensive. And essentially it's made from carefully processed leather, vellum, which is the stuff used for the Codex Sinaiticus, is a very fine kind of parchment. It's made from the skins of either immediately newly born or actually even unborn animals. And it's a very fine writing material, but very, very expensive indeed. And the church just simply couldn't afford it, while it was an independent organization, as it were, independent ecclesias. So the next issue was that of writing style. Handwriting changes with time, and Greek scribal writing changes more rapidly than most. And these changes, of course, can be used to work out the date of the manuscript, which you can work out from the style of the handwriting. And the kind of writing that's used, the particular style of writing, is known as unsealed script for the Codex Sinaiticus, that is. So that's part of a column from the Codex Sinaiticus, and the text is the start of the Old Testament book of Lamentations, which you can see at the top. That's the title up here. Notice that the letters are all capital letters. Unsealed script just has capital letters. There are no lowercase letters at all. And the other thing you notice is that not only is there no punctuation, there's no spaces between the words, and that makes the text in general quite difficult to read. So there's an equivalent unsealed text. It's the same bit, in fact, the bit in the column underneath, translated into English and written in English uncials, is there, and you can see just how difficult that is to read. And that carried on for quite a long time, but in the 9th century, early in the 9th century, someone invented a new kind of script. There it is, and that's minuscule script. It has upper and lowercase letters. There are spaces between the words. There's punctuation, and there are accents which indicate how you pronounce the word, where the emphasis goes, and when you can breathe. So the difference between an a and a ha, for example, doesn't appear in the unsealed script. Letters, that means letters can be a lot smaller. You can well, modern scholars, modern people find the unsealed script easier than this. This is a very difficult handwriting to read for me, at least, and most other people find the same. But people at the time found it much easier to read, so they could read it with small letters. You could make your book smaller, use less parchment or less vellum to write it on, so it became cheaper. And very quickly people got so used to reading this, they stopped really being able to read unsealed, so they had to puzzle it out, and it took a long time. So they then transcribed a lot of their old unsealed manuscripts from the 4th century or even earlier into minuscule manuscripts. So in the scribes of the 9th and 10th century set up a real industry, full of energy, and copied their old manuscripts out into minuscule. So a lot of the ones at that age are actually copies of very much older manuscripts, and very well worth looking at. The oldest minuscule manuscript of the Bible that we know of is a minuscule of 4 Gospels, and that's happily the chap who wrote it wrote the date of the work at the end, and it was copied in 835 AD. Putting that together, the manuscripts of the New Testaments were originally written on papyrus in a something that looks very like unsealed script, but is actually rather angular to try and get over the roughness of the material you're writing on. And manuscripts like that are referred to as papyri, and they're identified by a letter P followed by a number. So the oldest one we've got, the Rylands fragment, is P52. The number is usually written as a sort of superscript, as a like a power. It looks like P to the power 52. That's papyrus 52. manuscripts at that point, most of them probably only contain one New Testament book, or maybe all letters, or a group of letters. We actually have got one that contains at least two Gospels, only two left, but it might have had more originally. And then in the 4th century, the state took over and started putting money into the church. They could afford parchment, and you get uncial manuscripts appearing, and the script becomes a bit more flowing, a bit easier to read, because they've got a nice even surface on your parchment. And manuscripts like that are called uncial manuscripts, and you identify that either by a letter or by a number preceded by a 0. So Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, let's talk about that one, is B, which is what Griesbach gave it, or it's 03, which is what a more modern number would be. Having a 0 in front says it's an uncial. So the papyri, gradually people stop writing on papyrus and start writing on parchment, gives over to uncials. And then actually a much more sudden change in the 9th and 10th centuries, mainly the 10th century, over into minuscules, and those are identified with just a number. Griesbach numbered them, and we used his numbers, and of course there are many more than he knew about. The oldest one we've got being minuscule 461. And then copying goes on in this minuscule way until we get to printing, and finally printing takes over, and modern Bibles are, of course, almost entirely printed. There's hardly any of them left that are copied by hand. The Codex Sinaiticus contains just over 400 pages like that. Each one is written on both sides. The writing is uncial script on vellum, mainly from cows. A few pages come from sheep. And it's estimated that the cost of the materials, copying and binding for the whole codex would have been about the lifetime earnings for someone on a sort of moderate income. So it would be about £1.1 million in today's money. The content of the book, you can see what it's got. It originally had the whole of the Bible in it, but pages have been lost, quite large chunks of it have been lost. So you can see, fortunately, nearly all lost from the Old Testament, not the New Testament. And we've got lots of witnesses for the Old Testament besides this one. So you can see the bits that are missing. There's hardly any of the Pentateuch still there. There's a little bit of the historical books. Psalms is well represented, and bits of Proverbs. There's missing bits in the prophets, but only a bit. And then you've got the whole of the New Testament there. It's dated for the most part by the style of the handwriting. Now, the handwriting would put the manuscript somewhere around 300 AD. It's quite an old-fashioned handwriting for the 4th century, but it's divided up according to something called the Eusebian canons, which was what they did before they had chapters and verses. They broke it into sections, and each one was numbered, and the sections allow you to find the particular bit of text you're interested in. What's rather nice about them is that if you have the reference number, the Eusebian canon gives you the parallel bits, so that if you're looking in Matthew about the feeding of the 5,000, say, the verse number in Mark is exactly the same, and so is the one in Luke, which is I thought quite clever. That's the way Eusebius did it. But he devised his Eusebian canons in about 330 AD, perhaps 325 AD. So the manuscript couldn't possibly be any earlier than that. So most scholars will put it between 340 and 360. That's the latest possible date that handwriting of this particular style was used. I think I'll put it at the beginning of that period rather than the end of it. Well, what's 20 years? in something as old as that. So the crucifixion of Jesus is in 30 or 33 AD, and the evangelists and prophets wrote the New Testament books somewhere in the period between 48 and probably 66 AD, the Revelation being the exception to that, possibly. The end of the New Testament period marked by two events which change the religious aspects of the ancient world, at least as far as Christianity was concerned. And they were the fire of Rome in 64 AD, which led to the start of persecution of Christianity under Nero and continues on for some centuries. And then there's the Jewish War between 66 AD when it starts, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and it ends with sort of mopping up operations, the fall of Masada in 74 AD. And that also changes what the way that the world perceives Judaism and Christianity. Once Nero had declared Christianity as an illegal religion, persecution, it carried on at a low level right the way through. So if the crops failed in a city, they'd go and find some Christians and put them to death. But in general, they'd leave them alone. Although if you were robbed, you better not go to the police, because as soon as they find you're a Christian, you'd be in trouble. But there were also periods, I marked them in dark grey as opposed to light grey for the background persecution, when the emperor was actively ordering them to seek out Christians and kill them. And it got quite serious. The Great Persecution was very bad at the end of that period. The period of persecution ended it's about 318, beg your pardon, with the Edict of Milan. Constantine issued an instruction not to do it, along with his rival for the throne, and did the persecution of Diocletian and Galerius, the Great Persecution. It wasn't given from Milan, and it wasn't an edict, but apart from that, the name's a very good one. And then in 324, Constantine defeats his last rival and becomes the sole Roman emperor. There's nobody else claiming that. And around that time, he developed a sort of Christian outlook, though he wasn't actually baptized until the year of his death, which was 337 AD. And he decided he wanted to make the church an arm of state, which had its price for the church, but it was seen as much better than the persecutions that preceded, and the church became part of Constantine's empire, as it were. But what that did was to open the resources of the state. Constantine, for example, ordered 50 copies of the Bible to be produced for churches in Byzantium, probably more at other times, and it's thought that the Codex Sinaiticus may be part of that. It would take quite a long time to fulfill that order for 50 Bibles. Remember, 2 years to copy it, but you've got to collect together the material, and they're going to cost £1.1 million each. So you're talking £55 million spent on books for the Bible by the state. It's quite a staggering amount. You can't imagine that nowadays. So the Codex Sinaiticus is possibly one of these Bibles. There are other large manuscripts produced, funded by the state around this time. That's the Codex Ephraemi Receptus there. This one's the Codex Alexandrinus. That one is the Codex Vaticanus. They're all early manuscripts. Now, the first manuscripts were given identifiers which were letters. And they thought that the Codex Alexandrinus was earlier. Now we think that the Codex Vaticanus is earlier, but so Alexandrinus was given A, Codex Alexandrinus was given A, Codex Vaticanus was given letter B, Ephraemi Rescriptus was given C, and so on. But then Codex Sinaiticus was discovered, and Tischendorf decided that was earlier than any of them. It's because of the late date for B, later date for B. And so he thought, well, we better have a letter that comes before A. There isn't one. I know, I'll pick a Hebrew letter, so that one gets the Hebrew letter Aleph as an identifier. Didn't work for too long, because what happens is that they run out of letters. They find more than 26 manuscripts, 27 including the Codex Sinaiticus. They go on into Greeks for a bit, but soon run out of those as well, and they start numbering, and that's when you get a 0 in front of it to show that it's an unsealed manuscript. You've also got papyri, which are quite a bit earlier than that. So we've got whole books from around the year 200. Some of them, this one here is part of Luke and part of John. It's a bit earlier than that. P66 most complete John, probably around 200, maybe slightly earlier. And you get a lot of little fragments, the oldest of which is the Rylands fragment, which is, well, 120 maybe. Difficult to tell exactly, but certainly before 140 and probably after 90. See who wrote the Codex Sinaiticus. The writing of the Codex Sinaiticus was carried out by 3 different scribes, who are labeled, they're numbered, or whatever, they give them letters, A, B, and D. Now that's not somebody who doesn't know his alphabet. Originally they thought there were 4 scribes, but it turns out that A and C were the same one when people really analysed the handwriting very, very carefully. And rather than changing D's name, they kept it to stop confusion between different ages of book. Well, there's a nice description of the scribes in the Encyclopedia of New Testament Textual Criticism. It says of the 3, scribe D was the best, having almost faultless spelling. A, in spite of having a hand similar to that of D, was a very poor scribe. The only thing that could be said of him that was good was that he was better than B, whose incompetence is a source of almost continuous astonishment to those who examine his work. So we've got B, who is pretty, well, absolutely dreadful, A, who's not a lot better, but is a bit better, and then you've got D, who just does a few pages, but he's very, very good. And there are occasional pages which are sort of slipped in among the others. And it's thought that these were what are called cancels, the pages where the copying had so many mistakes that the page was removed and replaced by a newly copied page. And D would then be a sort of supervisor who would make sure that things were right. And it was then corrected, so it happened a lot. You make a manuscript, someone reads through it, compares it with the exemplar, maybe with another manuscript as well, and corrects the text. And the 2 different people in the 4th century had a go. A first did it and corrected his own efforts, and then scribe D went through the manuscript, correcting both A and B, and sometimes correcting the corrections to A. And that set of corrections is given little letter A, this little a, to show what happens. Then in the 5th and 6th century, somebody else went through it and did the same thing, maybe more than one. And there's another go in the 7th century, which is correct to C, and the 12th century someone went through and he's correct to E. E only corrected the Old Testament, and he left a note at the end of the book of Esther, which allows us to deduce that the manuscript was then in Caesarea, which is about the time, well, it had been in Caesarea from the time when the Muslims had invaded Palestine. Sorry, that's C who leaves that note in there. It's quite interesting looking at the corrections you get in there. People write comments about it. So this way has been corrected. It is Vaticanus, not Sinaiticus. And the later corrector disagreed with the correction and has written in the margin, "Fool and knave, leave the old reading and do not change it." Actually, the corrector was quite correct. It should have been changed. The second corrector was actually wrong to say it was shouldn't be changed. Nonetheless, he was quite insulting in the way he wrote it. There are thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament now, almost 6,000 in Greek, another 18,000 in translations in other languages. No two are identical, but because the differences are so minor, then you can expect that. By the way, is a picture showing the extra pages that were discovered in St. Catherine's Monastery, just a few of them. Here's an example of the kind of change that you get, the kind of difference between different manuscripts. And if you get a modern translation, then it will say, when they'd spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Italia. This is Acts 14:25. But if you have the Codex Sinaiticus, it says, when they had spoken the word of the Lord in Perga, they went down to Italia. And there's another variant around, which is when they had spoken the word of God in Perga, they went down to Italia. Now, these are hardly earth-shattering variations. It doesn't make any difference at all to the story. They preached the word, either the word of the Lord or the word of God or just the word, and then went on to Italia. No one would disagree with what happened there, but the copying is there. Think how a textual critic would tackle it. Well, the first thing you'd do is you'd make a list of the manuscripts that contain each variant. So this variant, it's in the Codex Vaticanus, it's in D, it's in these minuscules, it's in a huge number of texts copied in Byzantium, which were very, very similar. The Byzantium was very wealthy and people owned lots of Bibles, and so they made lots of copies. That's lectionary. That's Bible written out in a different order, ready for reading, like according to the reading plan. If you made a Christadelphian lectionary, you get the Bible reading planner, you copy out. First page would be Matthew 1 and 2, followed by Psalms 1 and 2, followed by it'd be Genesis 1 and 2, Psalms 1 and 2, and Matthew 1 and 2, and then you go back to the 2nd of January's readings and so on in that order. The lectionaries have this, and so on. We've got various translations, one Latin translation, Coptic, we've got Ethiopic. The word of the Lord appears in the Codex Sinaiticus, in the Codex Alexandrinus, and so on. And we can look at all these different variants and compare them together. And, well, there are lots of them. It's not too difficult to start working out how the variations occur, and one can construct a pretty accurate text for the actual New Testament. But usually the variations are so minor that it doesn't really matter very much anyway. It's interesting to compare the number of witnesses available for the Bible with those for other ancient documents. So for the New Testament, it's copied. I've said it's written by 70 AD. Ignore the Revelation anyway. We've got oldest fragment 120. We've got single books by 200 AD for most of them, and we've got the Codex Vaticanus, which is the earliest complete New Testament, by 330. Thereabouts. And altogether, well, when I did this comparison, there were 5,800 Greek manuscripts. It's rather more than that now. I keep on finding new ones. If you compare that with other ancient books where people don't worry about the text at all, they're quite happy that the text is correct. The Thucydides, 8 manuscripts, Tacitus, Annals, 20 manuscripts, Pliny, just the 7, so on. Look at the gap. So Thucydides writes his history about 400 BC, and the first copy we have is 900 AD. But for Tacitus' Annals, he writes that about 100 and, well, I put 100 there, but it's probably more like 105 or something like that. And our first manuscript somewhere around 1100. They're only 20 anyway. We've got a much better set of witnesses for the New Testament than for any other piece of ancient literature that there is around. And if you start to think what's the scale of the problem, there are about 138,000 words in the New Testament. It's just a few dozen over that. Of those words, 912 are in dispute. That's it. If you look at it as a proportion, all those squares there represent words in the New Testament. The ones in cream with a black surround are ones undisputed, and the red one is the disputed ones, and they don't affect really any major teaching of the Bible. They're things like, was it the word they were preaching? Was it the word of God? Or was it the word of the Lord? Very similar ideas. So our text is pretty secure. So what have we seen? Well, first of all, we've seen there's a great deal of evidence around about the text of the New Testament. It's not just something that depends on one or two rather disreputable manuscripts. There's a huge amount of evidence there in Greek manuscripts, translations, citations in ancient authors, and so on. You can really, well, you need a computer to deal with it all nowadays. And that allows us to decide not only what the most likely text is, but it shows us that text is extremely reliable. So for something like Tacitus, you can say, well, probably that. Might be this, but probably that one. But you can't estimate how confident you should be because you don't have enough manuscripts to go at it. In the case of the New Testament, you do. And finally, the important one is that the text of the New Testament is essentially the same as the text that has always been known for the New Testament. Manuscripts stay the same from medieval times, from late antiquity, from the time of Constantine the Great, even back before then. The text hasn't changed. And that, I think, is the important thing to get from looking at manuscripts like the Codex Sinaiticus. And that's where I finish.